Hello, listeners, and welcome to Privacy Chats with Rachel and John. This is a podcast for privacy professionals and enthusiasts alike. I'm John.
I'm Rachel, and today we're going to be talking about one big elephant in the room. What will the state of privacy look like post 2024 election?
Yeah, and so thanks for bringing this one up, Rachel. I think this is going to be a super interesting topic, and kudos to you. You did most of the research on this one, but I'm happy to have the chat. I think it's interesting because usually the buzz around election is about the integrity and if politicians were hacked or if votes were stolen or what other bad disinformation is out there. It's just a chaotic time.
Yeah, it's usually that pre-election buzz. I agree. There's definitely plenty of news circling around that still. And it's been really heightened, I feel like, since 2016, just because of the role social media and technology is, of course, played in that. Do you remember when the Russian government, was revealed to have fear with the presidential election back in 2016? That was like crazy.
I do. I remember it, and it's kind of weird because it's one of those things that gets really complex, and people are saying that there's not a lot of truth, and then people kind of dig in on their own side of those issues. So it was hard to really pin down, exactly what happened, and then what are the implications from a legal perspective and international law, and what's going on with all of that.
Yeah, and not to downplay, it as its own scenario, but it kind of watching it at the time resembled some like action cybercrime movie or a drama when the news actually came out. Like there was like spear phishing involved,
Yeah.
email alerts that were masked to be something else, and infected links and malware, the whole 9 yards, right?
Yeah, it's true, but really, some of those things are far more simple than people realize. And maybe they're realizing it better more now. Like there's more awareness about cybersecurity and best practices, and you think about the like 2016 was 8 years ago,
Yeah,
which for me seems like yesterday, but in the technology industry, that's a huge amount of time.
eons.
8 years is huge. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean it was a global conversation too, right? Because like the international law aspect of it, it didn't make it really clean to kind of point fingers. And even if you did, I mean,
Yeah.
there's like what type of framework do you have with meddling with a whole other country's election, right? Like the hacking into the DNC, releasing emails. All the
Right.
international lawyers were like seemingly divided over whether it could have violated any international law that had the precedent at the time for this sort of thing.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I think that all countries would agree, that's
Yeah.
something that you shouldn't do. But I think it's changed the nature of elections. Like technically, as voter registration systems, they rely on technology distributed across lots of different systems. And I go back to like the 2000 elections with Bush and Gore. It was all about, there was punch ballots and there was, dimpled chads. You're probably not going to remember all this, but it was because of markings on paper ballots. And I think there was a big push to we need to use more technology. But then you look at some of the weaknesses in technology and say, well, we should go back to the paper ballot. So I don't know. We're let's I
Yeah,
could
we're
I
off
could talk
track.
about this all day. Yeah,
It'll stay messy for as long as I think humans are involved in it, right? But
it's
back
true. Yeah.
back to business. What do we expect this next administration's plan to look like for technology policy in particular? So first, I want to take a moment to recognize that this is going to be sensitive in nature, this whole conversation. And it
Yeah.
feels irresponsible to pursue with an episode like this without acknowledging that upfront.
Yeah, I think that's fair because we are going to get a little bit political here, and our own opinions might seep through just a little bit. And there's definitely some really strong opinions and emotions on both sides of this divide.
Yeah.
But now that the elections are over, I hope that as a country we can all unite and go back to focusing on other things. And I was actually originally going to say to go back to not paying any attention to it whatsoever. But we shouldn't. Like we really need to pay attention to what's going on. But I just wish we could be more united about it.
Yeah, I 1,000% wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I'm of the opinion it's impossible to dedupe some of the aspects of this conversation that,
Yeah.
would sound politically biased and to some people. And the reality is like the government plays such a big role in the behavior and response of the tech sector and consumers, the whole environment.
And I think there's a lot of responsibility for a country like ours that we've got such an embedded role in the international technology and international, economies and ecosystems. Like there's a lot on our shoulders here.
Yeah, agreed. And these conversations are necessary regardless of where you stand, right? Because I think as privacy professionals, we wonder what the future of digital policy would look like under, again, an administration we've already seen too. And
Yeah.
AI has taken such a bigger role in the campaigning even down to this election.
Yeah, agreed. And the outcome of the presidential election is something that's interesting to dive into from lots of different angles, whether you're talking about privacy policy or different things. Like this is historic. Um, but privacy and cybersecurity concerns aren't new. They've continued to grow in public consciousness in the last 8 years. Some of it because of these things that have happened.
Agreed.
So, I don't know that everything is going to be the same as in the past. I think there's definitely been an evolution in our minds about some of this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I had a few loose expectations on predictions, I guess, from others
Okay.
going into this chat. But I did a little bit of validation through, the research of this episode of my own this weekend. And I won't sit here and pretend like I have all the answers because honestly, a lot of what Trump even says in his campaignings to his constituents ended up just being bluntly like not true at the end of the day. So it gets tricky.
Yeah. Yeah. Agreed. Yes.
But with all that out of the way, I will open with my first prediction, which is that we will likely see a revocation of former President Joe Biden's big series of executive orders related to artificial intelligence.
Yeah. I'm worried about that. So tell me why do you have that as a
Well,
prediction?
the strongest indicator and something that reminded me of it is that he very recently just promised to do so in a speech he gave to a post-election night party in Florida. President Trump did.
Yeah, I don't put a whole lot of weight into things that he says at
Yeah.
parties because I think sometimes he says the things that he thinks that are going to make him look good in front of
Mhm.
that particular audience in that moment. Because I really thought that the effort to contain the harmful impacts from AI, for example, was kind of across the board. It was a bipartisan effort.
It is. It seems to be. You can tell it's nuanced, and Trump has been very pro deregulation across the board, especially leading up to the election.
Yeah,
But he's also claimed historically that he supports this concept of quote trustworthy AI, which still resembles what Biden was pursuing as well, to your point. But since 2016, he's never really done anything, it looks like, to pursue legitimate measures to regulate private sector's development of AI.
yeah. Okay, so there's a bit of a disconnect there, but what's the impact of like if he were to revoke Biden's executive order, what would be the impact of that?
Yeah, according to policy experts, agencies would now no longer be required to test algorithmic systems that the government uses for inappropriate biases when making decisions. And this slew of executive orders is kind of already in in motion, right? So
Yeah.
it's hard to tell unless you're in these agencies like how much would have to be revoked here. But the end result impact, if it were to have happened, was that federal agencies wouldn't know or wouldn't be required to know whether their systems were making decisions based on something like race or sex rather than whatever the main component of that decision making should have been.
Yeah.
In that sometimes that's just an inherent condition of AI, and you have to detect for those biases and protect against them.
Yeah, and I would point any listeners to some previous episodes because we went in pretty deep into that a few episodes ago. But I have to wonder, like, focusing on the administration issues, what would happen with the remainder of those series of executive orders from Biden, if they were revoked? Like, it's been a while. Like this,
Yeah.
he didn't do those. Like the first one that I read about, I think, was early in his administration. So,
Yeah,
you
2020,
get
2021.
right. So you allow something like that to run its course for 4 years. I can't imagine it's easy to roll that back.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't much more concretely out there as far as which aspects of the collection of executive orders would be revoked and what policies regarding AI Trump supports and what it doesn't. But
Yeah.
it wouldn't be easy to undo. And like a lot of the deadlines I've read, for complying with these requirements and stages have technically already passed. But
Mm.
I've also read it's not impossible to, cut these things in motion and revoke them entirely either. It'll just be a matter of how much, to what degree, and exactly when.
Yeah. So really, that sounds like it wouldn't be just a case of stop implementing that. It would be a case of, okay, we've got to completely roll it back and put other programs in place. But like national security is something that, Trump seems to be a big fan of. And he often talks about national security in his speeches and things like that. So what about those?
Yeah, I thought of that as well, and in a little bit of a tangent, his whole slews of podium talks about free speech and how it's in danger and whatever. But I'll address the part of national security just as my kind of my next prediction, actually.
Okay.
Um, for national security policy, Biden did release another executive order dedicated to, quote, the restriction of foreign sales of sensitive data to adversarial countries. I think this would likely continue based on the signals and what we're talking about with Trump's priorities under this new administration.
Mhm.
Since this executive order does restrict the transactions that can disclose like large amounts of sensitive personal data to any form of government, across the globe. But in particular, 6 countries of concern are cited as being applicable to date.
Yeah, so that's interesting, and that in some ways sounds a little bit like the European Union's approach to controlling data transfers, which is a big deal we've talked about in other episodes. Let's not get into that rabbit hole now, but it's a little bit mimicking what the EU is doing.
Yeah, of course. And I'll sidetrack and say that, for listeners hearing about these executive orders, we'll link all of them in the description below. It'll drag out our talk if we always say the names and the numbers, and I might screw it up anyway. So just as a disclaimer though, but yeah, the security policy one is has a funny resemblance to what the EU's been doing with controlling data transfers out to different countries. Um,
Hmm.
and I made that comparison as well, but it looks like the EU takes kind of an opposite approach to the US, or vice versa as far as how those outbound transfers are restricted. So Biden's executive order specifically bans the bulk transfer for specific categories of information for a specific set of countries. So the US identifies, this list of 6 are no-goes, right?
Yeah,
The EU seems to take like a reverse approach to that by generally banning all outbound transfers unless you've certified with them. It's kind of like an opt in for other countries for transfers to the EU. And that's what they call adequate. The country's
yeah.
considered adequate if they have a certain bar of data protection policies that align with the EU's as well.
Yeah, and that's true. It's a little bit of an oversimplification because there are other legal mechanisms which are necessary because for a while that adequacy process didn't exist. Well, the adequacy process for transfers to the United States didn't exist. That's been fixed now, but so there are other mechanisms. But yeah, it's an interesting observation. Yeah,
Yeah, in all in summary, I think that national security is an overlapping priority as far as outbound data transfers between the Biden and the Trump new administration. So I don't expect that in these slew of executive orders to be rolled back. And if Trump does, I would see something very similar replacing it. But going on to my next prediction here, and
okay.
this one has to do with the United States de facto regulator in the privacy and information security space, which is the Federal Trade Commission.
Yeah, so I knew you were going to talk about that, and I'll just not to get on a soapbox too much, but I actually don't like that the regulation of privacy is largely in the hands of the FTC, and it's not because I've got any beef with the FTC. In fact, I think that they've been doing a great job, particularly recently. But as their name implies, their focus is on the protection of trade. It's about commerce, and there's a lot of other implications for people's privacy data that's beyond commerce. Now, there are some exceptions, like, a lot of people are familiar with HIPAA, which isn't enforced by the FTC because it's about medicine or health. But anyway, I'll get off the soapbox. But so since we're talking about the FTC, what is your prediction about what's going to happen there?
No, I agree, but I think we will see new leadership changes at the FTC as a direct result of the new administration.
Okay, I can see, yes, there's going to be a lot of new leadership across the administration. So I agree, but I don't think it's been because going to be because of policy goals or what the administration wants to do around privacy. My impression is that Trump is going to want people who are loyal to him in many positions, in as many positions of power as possible. And it doesn't seem like, based on his last administration, that he's always looking at, the people with the best credentials for a particular role. So in this case, talking about the FTC, I think this would have a huge impact on privacy because of the extent of FTC's role in privacy. And there's laws that they're tasked with enforcing, like the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, which is huge. We've talked about the importance of protecting children.
Yeah.
The GLBAA, the Grand Lease Bliley Act. So there's a lot of work for them to do, and I think if we have the wrong person at the helm, I'd be worried.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. Through Biden's term, I mean, the FTC has also been super active in
Mm.
applying pressure to tech companies and in telecom companies, using the breadth that they've kind of been given as, again, the the best fit for what the US has as far as enforcement for something like privacy. In 2023, the FTC brought like multiple huge actions against companies for failing to properly protect their data. So they've been aggressive in the recent past.
Yeah, they have, and I've read a lot of stories about those, and I think that the FTC often uses, they've got pretty broad powers um, to ensure like fair business practices and stuff like that. And some of that, I think we've talked about this before, goes back to the FTC Act, which was, I think that's created the agency, but that goes
Mhm.
back to 1914. So there's a lot of history there, and I can definitely see Trump taking a softer stance on some big tech companies. But like there's some mixed messages there also. Like he seems to have formed a tight bond with Elon Musk, who
Mm.
he does own other things, but one of the things he owns is a large tech company. But on the other side, he also doesn't seem to be a fan of some of the leaders of some of the large tech companies. But while he was president, he did start to take action against TikTok.
Yeah.
So it's hard to tell. So what do you think is happening
Yeah.
there? What's
Now, I open this with like, vaguely large leadership changes. I'm
Yeah.
pretty focused on Lina Khan, who is the current chair of the FTC, and the fact that she would be the one out of the job first in my prediction, but for a couple of reasons, right? Um, she had sat, so as a background, she had sat as the chair during Biden's term and isn't,
Mhm.
for a lot of reasons we're talking about here with the aggressive pursuit of tech companies regulation. She's not very popular with Republicans. She's pushed out a lot of legal action that has been criticized, not just for being too aggressive as a broader umbrella, but for specifically overstepping the FTC's regulatory authority. And from one big old report that's being created around her,
Mhm.
disregarding the independent role of the FTC throughout her term.
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard some of that stuff, but yeah,
Like
tell me
how?
more. What did you find? Yeah,
um,
right.
she's basically brought the FTC too far into the private sector's businesses and assumed the role of other authorities, to what you were alluding to earlier, by,
Mhm.
in some cases, trying to write new rules that intend to take the same magnitude of or force as a law. And this is a problem because the FTC has historically operated more like a law enforcement type agency rather than a rule-making legislative agency.
Yeah, so okay, I get it. And so like the line there is the difference between legislation and regulation. So the legislation enables an agency like that to implement regulations. But I
Mhm.
can see that there's some gray lines there. So really, in simpler terms, there's a perception among some regulators, you particularly mentioned Republicans, that the FTC is out of their swim lane. They're doing stuff that they
Exactly.
shouldn't be doing. Okay.
Exactly.
So 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 what's the impact? What's the implication of Trump winning the election? What's going to
Now,
happen? Isn't she supposed to? Her term is supposed to be over. I forget what their term limits, not term limits, but what is the term of that
yeah,
appointment?
yeah. So I guess her term is up anyway, but timing matters here because the appointment of the FTC chair, in light of Lina Khan stepping down, is up to the president's discretion, which is something I recently learned.
Yeah, I know that's true for a lot of those yeah, agency positions, although they do have to get confirmed, I think. So who's better to fill that role? And, how could a new person in that role change the landscape of privacy? I'm going to say regulation or rules because it's not legislation. They're not
Mhm.
legislators, they're regulators. So what's going to happen?
Yeah. So without going too much into too much detail and dragging this talk out too far, there are a few speculative replacements that, based on their public stances, mostly align with the priorities of Trump, like online privacy for children and teens, and in all of the hoopla that's been in the news about that recently.
Hmm.
Going back to the AI regulation stuff, though, there's already a lot of efforts already put into motion for those algorithmic, testing requirements and stuff. So I would expect whoever does take that replacement may support those coming to a halt. It's very hard to tell. But there are a few other commissioners over at the FTC that very much would align with the priorities of the Trump administration and Republicans in general.
Yeah, I get that. So there is a possibility they could kind of halt things or slow them down. But really, I think that in some ways that's a machine that can't be stopped. So I think if they were to stop it, it would be temporary. I think that the larger societal implications of things like artificial intelligence and machine learning are too big of an impact on people's lives for them to escape regulatory oversight. So
Yeah.
so I think if the administration were to pull back, it actually would create an opportunity for tech companies to kind of step up to the plate and implement safe practices themselves, and even perhaps, heaven forbid, that they would collaborate with each other. Um, I, I don't necessarily have high hopes that they'll actually do that, but it's an opportunity for them. But I think, yeah,
Yeah, and we're talking a lot about the government's role here, of course, and in that
yeah,
case, the lack thereof. If this isn't something
yeah,
that is continued to be pursued from a regulatory perspective, but there's also the consumer trust component that I think goes hand in hand a lot of times with the perspective of governments, but not always. Like it's not. I don't think it's as divisive to agree that children's online safety is a concern, or
right,
AI has its risks from a societal level that we need to think ahead on and prepare for. But
yeah.
what is how that's done and where those lines are drawn. And I think it would be a competitive advantage for tech companies if they could continue, in the ways that some are getting ahead of that conversation, and in other cases trying to catch up to a new norm that's being set by what is being released. Products change every day, every month,
Yeah.
so there's an opportunity to take advantage of the interest in this from actually a commercial perspective. So I agree it's maybe doubtful as a whole for companies in the past just pursuing ESG type efforts just because, but I have a hard time thinking that it wouldn't be advantageous for them to do so despite what the government requires here in the US.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how the tech companies react to whatever the regulatory environment is. But I think in the long run, to my earlier point, if AI were to remain unregulated or to go back to being unregulated or less regulated or something like that, eventually it's just going to lead to harm to people in our society. And I think that when that harm happens is when there's an outcry and people are going to say, this is outrageous, something's got to be done about this. And then, people who are up for election will say, well, I'll fix that problem
That
for you.
reactive cycle. Yeah,
Right. So, it's going to be a little bit late, and unfortunately, people will have been harmed in that process. But I think it's inevitable that AI and ML and that whole industry is going to be regulated. It's just a case of how and by who and to what extent. What are the details and the nuances of those regulations? But I think they are going to happen.
totally agree. Now we covered a lot and not a lot, I feel like, in this episode, because there's a lot that's left to be
Yeah.
observed. I'll close out the episode to summarize the three predictions I had, and a lot of that you've contributed to as far as justifications for why. So prediction one, we're likely going to see some revocation throughout previous President Joe Biden's series of executive orders on AI and safety of AI. Second, we'll likely continue to see national security policies persist, whether that's through the executive orders already released by previous President Joe Biden throughout Trump's terms. And three, we're going to see some shakeup at the FTC from a leadership standpoint and perhaps from a behavioral standpoint as well with this new administration. But I think those are three solid predictions that I can make based on the publicly available information and truly from policy experts, at the IAPP, and those are a lot closer to Washington than I am. So I can wholeheartedly say that I trust the information sources I'm consuming, but I invite anyone listening to do that effort and research themselves as well.
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing up the predictions. I honestly, I hadn't thought about it. So I actually agree with your predictions. It's a little bit scary, but this stuff is important, and certainly important to you and I, since we spend so much time talking about this stuff. So I'll say thank you to you for bringing up this topic for this episode and doing the research on it. And I guess that I think that's a wrap. So thanks to you, and thanks to everyone for listening.
One little disclaimer before I forget. Of course,
that's right.
All of
the lawyers want to hear this.
The lawyers want to hear this. All the information I've shared throughout this episode is of the opinions of our own and not in any way affiliated with our employers or other organizations. These episodes are produced on our own time and are based on our own research and professional opinions.
Thank you for adding that. We can't forget that. All right. See you next time.